Welcome to episode 11 of Radio Omnicor. I'm your host, Colleen McLintock, and you're listening to the show that is guaranteed to teach you something useful from our dynamic guests. You can find all our podcasts on iTunes and our website, www.omnicor.co.za. Our episode today takes a behind-the-scenes look at competencies and how they are evolving to align with the demands of the future world of work. And the best qualified person I can think of to help unpack this is Cathy Farlam Ashton, our guest today. Cathy is one of the founding partners of Omnicor and is well known in the industry to have a treasure trove of insight and knowledge across many HR disciplines, gained through working at the rock face for more than 20 years. She holds degrees in fine arts, philosophy, and psychometry. You will often hear at Omnicor someone shout down the corridors, "Just ask Cathy." Cathy is currently a partner at Multiplex and works globally in the HR and coaching space. We are thrilled to host Cathy Farlam Ashton. Welcome, Cathy. It's so wonderful to have you in the studio. And it's especially wonderful because without you, there would be no Omnicor. So you're still part of our environment and our culture. And you've, particularly with me, you taught me everything I know about the topic on competencies and profiling. And no one better to have in the studio to take us through this narrative of competencies and how it's going to look, how these competencies going to align to the future world of work, which is it's a bit of a mystery. So welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for your very generous introduction.
Cathy, you know, wherever I go, very often people will say, "What happened to Cathy?" And everyone just seems to know you.
Really?
So, yes, you're very well known in nooks and crannies in our clients and in the corporate world. And I think for me, one of the reasons that I've brought you into the studio is just this topic on competencies. And you're so insightful around and so well read around the actual nitty-gritties. I mean, you were instrumental in the competency framework library that we wrote for a client, which was in itself a master, like a work of art. So maybe just starting off with some definitions. I think it's a bit of a technical podcast, but how would you describe a competency versus a skill? And
I mean, I guess it's interesting because it takes us right back to the beginning of Omnicor, actually, in the late 90s. And, you know, the Labour Relations Act in this country is very specific that you can only make selection decisions on inherent job requirements. And that really, you know, other than the language of competencies, it's very difficult to be able to define the less tangible aspects of jobs in anything other than competencies, because, you know, over all the years, people have tended to bring people in based on knowledge and technical skills and their qualifications, but we know that that's not necessarily predictive of success in the role. And that was also, you know, research done, you know, as early as the 1970s that said, why is it that people that have good academic, you know, do well academically don't necessarily succeed at work? And that started the whole assessment center movement, you know, for looking at particular patterns of behavior and then being able to map those patterns of behavior to what you would want to see at work, you know, on the understanding also that the way people habitually behave is the way that they are likely to behave in the work environment.
Right.
And so that really led to, you know, the competency movement did start in around in about the 1970s. But it really only gained momentum, I think, particularly more in the 90s. And I think part of it is also the changing world of work, that people don't come in anymore and have one defined job for life.
Right.
So as the workplace has become much more dynamic, you know, there's a need for talent mobility, you know, this whole concept of the war on talent and so on. And so then there's more of a focus on looking at what are the kind of behaviors that we would like people to demonstrate. Particularly also, I think the reliance on technical skills became less so because, you know, you can't go to university and study to work in a corporate investment bank, for instance. You know, a lot of the products are very specific, the kind of deal-making requirements are very particular. So So there's more and more of a focus on what qualities do people have, and how can we tie that back to inherent job requirements, and how can we bring somebody in with a set of what we now call competencies that are going to enable them to grow and develop across a range of roles within an organization. So I think that's probably really gave the movement impetus. There are still, it's interesting, when we first started working with competencies in the late 90s, there was a lot of, talk about how they're not really scientific and it's not going to last. But in fact, if anything, over the time that I've been working, I see more and more organizations using competencies. I think we don't yet really have another alternative. And I think part of it is because competencies are really patterns of behavior. They're patterns of behavior that can be stratified across job families and across organizational levels, right, which is different from a skill. A skill is a trainable, discrete domain of knowledge that you can go on a course and learn. So a skill has more of, clear knowledge and skill application. It's more defined in that way. Whereas a competency by its very definition is broader. And it needs to be more transferable.
So we have a lot of debates when we in the corporate and we're having these conversations. I think there is a skepticism around competencies, and it feels often that there is a lot of overlap. So when you define a competency versus a skill, there's often debate around, well, that's actually a skill. So would you say that a competency would encompass a level of skill?
A competency absolutely will encompass a level of skill, and a competency can be a skill too. So you'd get something like, let's say, business acumen, which is a competency and something which we can test for in assessment centres broadly. We can define what we mean by business acumen and test against that. But of course, there are 10,000 skills that different business people have in different environments. Everything from financial to marketing. I mean, the kind of skills that people get taught on an MBA, for example. But, this really what competencies give us, and I think the difficulty with competencies is that they're both an art and a science, and they are by their very nature quite abstract, because what we're talking about is a pattern of behaviors, a cluster of behaviors. And so inevitably there's also overlap between different competencies, but there needs to be that overlap because, for example, if you think about influencing skills, for instance, I mean, that is a big component of almost every leadership competency, for example. So you are going to see, we are going to see that overlap. The core skill really becomes in saying, if we look at a job at any level of work, right down from a guard in a van or somebody guarding a building right up to a CEO or a board member, what is the core set of competencies and skills that are needed to be successful in the role? What is the most predictive set of competencies that are going to, mean that somebody can succeed in a role? And of course, there may well be 27 that apply or more, but it's about looking to see what the top 12 are. So we came to an understanding over the years here at Omnicor initially, and we've taken it into Multiplex, of saying that every job can be defined by a core set of 8 to 12 competencies, of which we'd highlight, maybe 4 to 6 as critical. And of course, it is a bit arbitrary and subjective, but at least it's a way of saying, if you've done a good job profile, and you look at the verbs, because that's where competencies come from. They're behaviors that need to be able to be displayed. And if you look at the sequence of behaviors, typically often you'll find that it maps to a set of competencies.
So what is the trick that you have when you are, assigning? Because you're right, you have to. I remember you taught us to slaughter because you just want all the competencies. How do you help yourself to come up with those?
I think that's where a good job profile starts, and I think being able to define the job purpose in at the most 1 or 2 sentences, that already there are verbs in that sentence that speak to certain competencies. There's and then you just we look at the different components of the role, and we look at what verbs get repeat it again and again. And then that gives us a sort of an approximate set, and then we can go back and often check. We check to say, well, if somebody's particularly successful in the role, what are they doing? If somebody's not succeeding in the role, what's happening? And from that, we can calibrate that. So that set of competencies,
Are these inherent, or can you teach me to be better at analytical thinking?
You absolutely can teach. I mean, the cognitive competencies are harder to teach, but this is the thing, is competencies are not traits. So traits are your innate personality, and even, the debate about whether personality is innate or not is a whole nother story. I mean, I think there's, people have certain predispositions that then get cemented or embedded into, through the interactions with the environment. So somebody, for argument's sake, could be a deep introvert, which means that relationships tire them. It means that after a long day of interactions with people, they're exhausted. They like to have a quiet weekend to recharge, But most roles, even sort of back office, deep back office roles require an ability to build relationships, or certainly to work in a team. And if we can define what those mean in terms of the core behaviors, then we can hold people accountable for displaying those behaviors. And if needs be, they can go through a coaching intervention or a training intervention to develop them. But there is a big difference between personality and one's innate preferences and innate dispositions, as opposed to behaviors that people need to display in a particular role.
I was interested in what you were saying earlier around that the world of work is requiring us, to show up differently now. So
yes.
where do you think leadership is going? What sort of space is it going to end up in the next 5-10 years?
I mean, it's interesting, I think, in the whole debate around leadership, because, organizations are getting flatter. And, there's much more of a matrix environment. People are needing to self-manage. And I think the much harder thing is where you need to lead where you don't have formal authority.
The owner-manager culture.
The kind of owner-manager culture, where you need to lead through influence and so on. So, it's interesting. I mean, we talk about, leadership is one thing, and I think we see it all over the world in politics as well, that the business card is not enough. Leadership is about authority. It's about credibility. And it's about being able to maintain that authority and credibility consistently. And it's about being able to adapt to the requirements of different leadership situations. But there's no doubt that leadership can be taught. And if it couldn't be taught, all the leadership, the millions of dollars and euros and rands being spent on leadership around the world would be wasted. So you can train an unassertive person to be assertive. You can even train an analytical person to be analytical, although the coding, I think, around developing new cognitive habits, particularly to deal with, higher levels of complexity, is more onerous and would require enormous motivation, I think, on the part of the person needing to acquire those skills. But certainly, I mean, we see it happen all the time, and that's the principle of neuroplasticity. I love this idea that, I love all this neuroplastic science that's showing us how adaptable the human brain is, and how we can, through attention, through being motivated, we can build new wiring.
Where could we use competencies in the world of work?
So really, I mean, I see, and I don't know whether it's, obviously to a certain extent it is governed by my vantage point, but I see competencies as the golden thread pulling together all the different aspects of the HR value chain. So, an organization has a set of core competencies, or, a set of core capabilities that define its niche. It's a niche in the market. It has a strategy and it has a vision, and all of that can be translated into competency requirements. It doesn't help you've got a vision to be innovative and you don't have a single innovative person in the organization, or you're not recruiting for innovation. So it needs to pull right through. So ideally, you'd have this sort of mapping of kind of the capabilities that are needed by an organization. The core competencies that would be needed by the different role families and role streams, and then you can make sure that that's mapped back and properly reflected in individual role profiles, so that you can recruit against that, develop against it, performance manage, and particularly, I mean, I don't know how people do career pathing and succession without competencies, and I think the debate about competencies is less about actually what a competency really is if we unpack it, and more about a language. I think that the word competency is a slightly awkward word.
Right.
And some people like to call it capabilities but I think it is more semantic, because at the end of the day, if you're career pathing somebody into a role, particularly a role at a high level of complexity, you're wanting people to learn to, if somebody's going, for example, from a level 2 to level 3, they need to develop more confidence in their judgment. They need to develop an ability to influence. They may need to adopt a sort of continuous improvement kind of mindset. That would suddenly be a requirement at a level 3 that wouldn't be at a level 2, So part of I think what's so helpful about competencies, and part of the work that I'm doing, I'm trying to write a book on it. I'm not getting too
great.
I'm hopefully the book will be done by the end of the year. So it's a book that takes the whole competency debate and really kind of looks at it through a more kind of creative. I've tried to be very scientific about it, and then I realized, well, in the behavioral sciences, it's very hard to be very very precise. There are, so I can, we can take Elliot Jack's levels of work, and we can take a lot of the empirical work that's been done in defining capabilities in organizations. But at the end of the day, there's a sort of common sense pragmatism that I think needs to prevail as well. So that's why I think it's quite a difficult book to write.
Well, you're the one to write it, I promise you. Cathy, when we speak about problems with the competency world, I do hear people saying it can disadvantage certain people. Is that true, do you think, in your...
Well, I think, if we take the premise that people can learn and that competencies can be trained, these behaviors can be taught, they can be modeled, they can be taught, they can, I think at the end of the day, not everybody can do everything. And particularly in the world of work where from an efficiency, point of view, we're wanting smaller, more productive teams, I think there's often, there's more, people can be more empowered, ironically, if they know what it is that's expected of them, if there's clarity around the intention, if there's clarity around, what the skills and competencies are that are needed to do that. And I think not everybody is a fit. And I think part of the value of using competencies in a recruitment process, for example, we're not saying that somebody who doesn't get the job doesn't have a set of competencies. Of course they have. But it's not necessarily the set of competencies that is the best fit with this role. And why would you want to put somebody in a role where they're swimming upstream?
Right.
So I think, it's also about having coaching conversations even at that stage with people, that it's not about arbitrarily, including some people and leaving others out. I think it's about saying this is the requirement of the role at this level. These are the core competencies that we know predict success, and let's assess your match with that. We know from also years of assessment at Omnicor. You often will take somebody for a role that's recommended with caution. It may not be that somebody has all of the competencies, but certainly the ones that are most predictive in the role are those that are going to enable them to hit the ground running. And I think there's also, we can break people by putting them in roles that are not a fit for them
and displace them.
And that are at the wrong level, And it doesn't mean to say that the person in the fullness of time wouldn't have got there. But I think to put somebody in a role for which they're not yet ready breaks their confidence, causes stress, and brings out a whole lot of other compensatory behaviors that are then quite hard to undo,
So I have a favorite question which I asked Mark Kahn in our first episode. And it doesn't trouble me, but it concerns me a little around, you hear organizations speaking of culture fit and they're going to interview for that.
Yes.
And then they'll say, well, no, they just weren't a fit. And often to me that's based on bias. Can you use competencies in a culture fit way?
I think that's a brilliant question, Colleen. And I was actually talking about it to clients this very morning. We talk about the 3 legs of the table, that if somebody fits a role, they fit they're a fit with the technical knowledge, the skills, the knowledge, the qualifications, there's that's the one leg. The other leg is the core set of behavioral competencies. There may be many others that apply, but there's a core set of behavioral competencies that we need to try to define. And the other set is the values and how that translates into a set of behaviors. So values as values are quite abstract, but if we can translate the values into a set of behaviors and say that in our organization, this is the set of behaviors that we hold people accountable for, I think, that then becomes an inherent job requirement. It's part of the brand, and it's interesting because if you look at the most successful companies in the world, if you think of Apple, for instance, 800 billion, I'm not exactly sure what its figure was. You look at companies like very clear about their values. They might not be values that we necessarily would aspire to have as values in our own organizations. It doesn't necessarily, there's not a right or wrong here. But organizations that are very clear about their values, what they stand for, that have a clear culture, a clear identity, that has been correlated with higher, better performance. So I and actually also, I think certain cultures do fit some individuals more than others. So again, it's a choice. It's a choice. The issue is when, we don't like the fact that you came to the interview in grey shoes and, we don't think you're forceful enough, or we don't think you didn't make eye contact. So therefore so it's making those kinds of, the halo and horns effect, making those kind of assumptions based on kind of anecdotal evidence, that's a problem. But I think a systematic process of understanding whether somebody is a fit for a culture or not, based on a set of competencies that have been linked to values, I think is fair to both the person and the organization, And if I actually think for myself as an employer over the years, we have over the years occasionally brought people into the organization who were lovely people, but not a fit with this culture. A culture where maybe people needed to be a very strong owner-manager culture, a culture where the capacity to manage ambiguity is very high. That doesn't fit everybody. And then people can make that choice,
So what you're saying is it needs to be seen as part of the interview and asked in a competency-based interview approach, not just my gut feel is you don't vibe with the company. Exactly,
because then the halo and horns effect is coming in, and often then what happens is people have actually made up their minds in the first 3 minutes, and they spend the rest of the time confirming that,
Well, you'll be horrified, but probably not surprised that at a very big client of ours, we were doing a workshop, and one of the HR ladies came and said, I'm so disappointed. I thought I had found our new head of learning and development, but then I went on Facebook and I saw her pictures, and she doesn't look like she's right for the role.
Yeah.
So this is current. And I wonder where the whole social media takes the world of competencies and interviewing and bias.
I mean, it is difficult, and I think particularly with young people, people entering the world of work, it is difficult because, the Facebook that they started at 14, they weren't necessarily thinking about the world of work. And, yes, I mean, hopefully our children get some advice about what they can and can't post, But I mean, again, it would be unfair. If clearly based on, competency-based interviews, based on other forms of assessment, somebody is a fit with the role, and you decide not to take them based on some pictures that you've seen on them that, on Facebook. I think that would be unfair. Look, I mean, if people have, if there's any signs, obviously, of lack of ethics or, extreme lack of professionalism, of course, those are, you can't have somebody, particularly in a senior management role, conducting themselves in certain ways, But I think there's also, it's also the whole public, your public persona versus your private persona. And I think Facebook is a very, LinkedIn is a very clearly professional space.
Although some people haven't got that memo.
But I mean, I think there's more clarity around what LinkedIn is,
right.
That LinkedIn isn't a place where you have all your friends, whereas I think Facebook, it's very difficult. And also, what people post, on your behalf or people put on your wall, yes, of course you can choose to take it off. But I think it's very blurred
Or just check your privacy settings.
Check your privacy settings. Yeah. And also sometimes people have done things as a joke. And, yes, of course, a bad taste, racist in affair. Of course, that's a different story. But I think somebody who's maybe had a few too many drinks at a party, I mean, I certainly think that would be that wouldn't be class as an inherent job requirement.
Well, it's interesting because it segues into the question I have around how the world of work is changing with hot desking and virtual teams, and what are the competencies that you think these new fancy sexy ones that we need to start looking for?
No, it's so interesting you talk about the hot desking thing. I mean, some people love it and others really hate it. Hey? You know what I think it is? I mean, I think there's a lot of competencies that start with the word, that have the word agility in them. So whether it's, learning agility, political agility, organizational agility, interpersonal agility, leadership agility, all these things. And I think that is becoming more and more important because people need to have a level of flexibility and an ability to deal with ambiguity, fuzziness, complexity and change in a way that they didn't have to before. Of course it was there, but I think, there's new kinds, it's a new normal, when you've got a hot desking kind of environment. So, I think it is a mind shift, at first, and it comes with probably advantages and disadvantages, and it's probably a change management process for people who used to. But I think it is those agilities. People do need to be far more agile.
That seems like can you stratify that at a level 1? Agility almost feels like an oxymoron for a level 1.
I think there's agility within different mandates. So the kind of agility at level 1 would be around basically being able to adapt. You wouldn't ask somebody at level 1 to be innovating and to be really thinking outside of their defined box. But I think certainly people at level 1. You think about call centers and those roles that are very operational, very rule-defined. People need to have a lot of flexibility, a lot of resilience. I think it depends what we define agility as. And I think really at level 1, the flexibility, and yes, there's less fuzziness, there's less grey. Level 1 roles, even if they are hot desking, are governed by clear rules and procedures, clear outputs. So that becomes the firm ground.
Cathy, I'm interested to hear a bit more about what a suitcase competency is, or you call them meta competencies, or how does that work?
So a suitcase competency would be a competency like emotional intelligence, which has so many underlying facets. What has it defined? It depends on whose model of emotional intelligence you're using, but it has a defined number of underlying facets, each of which could be seen to be competencies in their own right. So you could aggregate it to give a sense of somebody's overall emotional intelligence, but often that would be prioritizing certain competencies more than others. So often, the sort of common sense understanding of emotional intelligence would be empathy and sort of social appropriateness, But it's also linked to things like impulsivity and stress management and all of that, each of which can be seen to be competencies in their own right.
So how do you apply that in recruitment, or do you just sort of focus on the most, as you've said, the priorities?
You would focus on what the priority is. Yeah, you would focus on what the priority is. And hopefully, you'd have a library of competencies that's been well enough defined.
Right.
That the definition stands without having to attach a whole lot of other competencies to it. Yeah.
You work with many organizations and have been involved in this field for so long. I mean, what changes have you seen in the competency library frameworks that you work with?
It's interesting. I've been surprised that there's a lot of commonality between competency frameworks. That's semantic again, different words for different things. Some competency libraries worry me in the sense that there are clear competencies missing. There's much more of a focus on the sexy competencies, creativity, and not a lot on rule orientation and excellence orientation and some of those kind of competencies. So sometimes when we're doing role profiling, for example, and we need to use particular libraries, my heart sinks because I know that those libraries are not, 38. There are not 38 competencies in the world of work. There's probably more likely around 70. If depending on how you cluster them, and I think there's an increasing focus on also the global competencies for people who need to work globally. So you've got competencies there like, people who display agility with languages, which is, so the ability, learning Spanish would be a skill, but the some people just learn languages much more quickly than others. Some people have a sensitivity to cultural nuances and so on.
My favorite is the political acumen.
The political acumen, yeah, political agility. And I think, often people think that that's, I don't have that. Well, they say, I don't do political agility, But unfortunately, if you're in a senior role, you have to do it. It's not that you do it; it's how you do it. Right. So you need to do it with authority, with credibility, with integrity. But I mean, you certainly can't be politically naive in a very senior role. It doesn't make sense. A lot of what you're doing is fielding conflicting messages, priorities, needs, demands, requirements.
And there's also a sort of a sentiment of EQ in that as well. Is that social inferencing?
There's social inferencing,
which
exactly.
Our global leaders currently just seem to really
Yes,
lack.
Isn't it interesting? I mean, it was funny because a lot of those competencies you think you sort of take for granted, and then President Trump comes in and you think, oh my word, there's a competency displays respect, which is, an interesting
executive disposition.
Executive, but I mean, just even, just being respectful towards people, not shaming the person, talking to behaviors and not trashing people, So, certain things, I think they've become so embedded, and it's almost, the challenge almost becomes to disembed some things that we so took for granted. That we may need to sort of disembed them and look at them and say, well, what does it mean to really display deep respect, particularly under stress, particularly when we're
not right,
when we're not right, and when it's hard to achieve. We have to choose between sometimes the lesser of two evils. What does it mean?
It's quite fascinating. Just really proves how role modeling works, because since that is the new normal. You're seeing communities and other political leaders in America just seeing that that's okay to behave that way.
Yes. So all of a sudden there's a culture of, it's absolutely fine to trash whole,
And it's happened very quickly.
This
culture.
I think he's given people permission, He's given, it's okay now to say certain things that we, certainly we would not, in terms of looking at statesmanship or stewardship, So I think that's another competency, actually, and another leadership competency, which is...
What is the definition of
that? So stewardship is really where you see yourself as a custodian of something that's going to live after you. So it's about, there's a certain kind of vision there. And, you think about that, is that only then, a level 5 and above competency? But it's actually not, because you think even a receptionist, can leave a legacy. This just if you're asking yourself this question about how am I going to make this easier and better for the person who comes after me, what legacy am I leaving?
Right. I think Priscilla would leave a legacy.
Absolutely, she'd leave a legacy.
For her friendliness and her warmth.
And her own journey. So
exactly. When you help companies with job profiling, one of the things that's very tricky and technical is deciding on the different, job families, and how do you, when you've got 3 roles that are very similar, how do you work out whether they should be just one role, or how do you come up with a better, more streamlined matrix? And then a follow-on to that would be, why is it beneficial to the organization?
I don't think there's a right answer. I think there's lots of different ways of doing it. And I think, we do talk about the difference between a role profile and a position profile, where we say the role profile is the role as it exists across the organization, and the position profile is the location-specific or the function-specific translation of that role, So... I think where we would say that roles, have, different positions could be clustered into one role if there's more than 70% commonality. But if there isn't, then it often means, often quite subtle competency changes. So, we were looking the other day at a client, and it was an inbound and outbound call center, in an inbound and outbound call center role in the same function. And it had been assumed that the competencies were the same, but when we profiled them, we realized that the outbound role, needed more perseverance. It needed more agility in terms of being able to, you didn't necessarily know, to how people were going to respond, whereas there was more, there was more stability in terms of, more predictability in the inbound role. So we often make assumptions about roles that then don't prove to be the truth once we analyze the role.
Right.
Yeah.
When you're working with teams in corporates, do you struggle to get buy-in from the management, or do you get more buy-in from the human resource?
It's interesting. I actually find, I think competencies help HR to do their job better, because I think, often the different aspects of the HR value chain are dealt with separately, and they're quite siloed, and it leads to, a common criticism of HR is that it doesn't tell one story, that it's, it's got this sort of octopus of kind of confusing messages, and the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. So I think competencies do help HR to create better alignment around that, and I think helping HR teams to think through that certainly brings a lot of clarity and becomes quite settling, in terms of the messaging that they're able to give to the business and how they're able to guide the business on who to bring on, who to promote, etc. In my experience, line management love this, because what can keep you awake at night is somebody who's not succeeding in the role, and it can create such a lot of negativity, and it can be so tiring, and often people do managers spend a lot of their time on the more challenging members of the team. And so I think creating more clarity around what the expectations of the role are, so that you can separate out the person who may be a very lovely person, from the requirements of the role. And I think, we use it a lot in our coaching. So a big focus of our coaching approach is on helping our coaching clients to understand what are the to decode, because it's often not made explicit. So it's around helping the client to decode what are the core competencies that are needed here, and at what level of complexity, and what does that look like, and what questions do I need to ask, and what do I need to find out to be able to do this. And that's often very liberating and very very helpful to the person, because they had no idea that a particular, I was coaching somebody yesterday, and she came to me saying that presentation skills were her issue. Right. But when we looked at it actually wasn't so much presentation skills. It was much more about buy-in, that she wasn't getting buy-in. And then we realized that she had much more of a telling than an influencing style. So we realized that actually presentation, she could do quite competent presentations, but it was much more about building relationships and influencing. And that those are the core competencies that she needs to focus on, and that was quite interesting for her, because here she'd been thinking that she needed to go on courses to become a better presenter, but that telling rather than facilitation, telling rather than facilitating was creating this lack of buy-in.
And I'm sure that must have sort of had a ripple effect in other areas.
I'm sure, yeah. But it was so interesting for her, because she came away from the session going, oh, okay, I see that the more I try and tell, the more I try, and the glossier and the better her presentation, she wasn't getting anywhere, I mean, we had another issue years ago where we were working in an organization where there were repeated complaints about customer service. And they'd thrown a lot of customer service at this area, and it hadn't worked. And then they thought, well, maybe it's assertiveness. So they threw a lot of assertiveness training. That still didn't work. And it turned out that the problem was that these people had very low levels of reasoning and problem-solving skill. And so the actual competency that was causing the problem was the fact that people would phone into this to have their problem solved, and the very nice person at the end of the call didn't have the basic smarts to be able to help them with that. So often what looks like the problem, using the language of competencies, is actually not the problem. And then, if you can get the competency right, it's the good to great, you can get the right people in the right seats on the bus, but you can also develop people, you can also work out what you need to develop.
So how would you take your client, for example, now with the telling versus facilitation? How would you work on that competency in coaching?
So it would depend. I think for her, it's really about now looking at the competency facilitation and influencing and really trying to understand what are its components. So as you know, done a lot of work in unpacking the competencies into behavioural indicators at the different levels, and that's part of what my book is about in certain ways, kind of the models around that. And so it's helping her to see, okay, her role is at level 3. It's a best practice role, where there is a requirement to optimize and enhance. So what does it look like for her? So part of it is sort of breaking it down into there's some skills involved there, and, so it's active listening, it's around pacing, it's around, so we'd use also, I guess, get her to identify people whose facilitation and influencing skills she admires, get her to really, pay attention to what it is that they do. We do role plays together. We get her to try and influence me on something. We practice it. Get her to then, between sessions, we spend time looking at this person, understanding also that there's a change management component often in getting people to change their mind. And that she was completely unaware of.
Right.
So what she thought was presentation wasn't at all. It was actually about influencing, facilitation, building relationships, and managing change. Those were actually the competencies that were her sticking points.
And I think just by what you did, by giving her that self-awareness and that shift in track, must be a huge part of the change required.
Yes, but I think people can, people when they know what it is, then you can get beyond thinking, well, what's wrong with me? Is it me? And going, okay, well, this I do well, but this is an area, and it's not an area I've thought about, and it's not an area that I've ever had any kind of formal development on. And often people are thrust into roles, without really being ready for those roles. And I think often if the competencies, if the role's not well defined, and if and I'm not talking about defining the role in such a way that people sit in their box and say they won't do anything, because it's not about that, I mean, a good role profile ideally has a shelf life of around 5 years,
Right.
It isn't a set of standard operating procedures. It's a picture of what the role looks like and what the accountabilities are, and it's a starting point for a conversation.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because there are organizations who will say they don't use that, and they will say it with a tone of it's really inhibiting for our organization to have such a thing. And yet when you talk to those people working in the company and ask them, do you know what is required of you? They'll say they don't know.
Yes.
And the reason behind that is given to say exactly that we don't want people in a box. We want people to be innovative and creative.
But I think that's about a level of, when any role profile talks about this, these are the core accountabilities of the role. That there may well be other requirements outside of it. And I think, I think people we're not talking about a role profile that defines everything, from sort of A to Z forever and ever. When we're talking about a platform that people can say, where do I focus my energy? What do I need to be focused on? Is this 50% a business development role? In which case, if I'm spending too much time on admin, I'm going to be, there's an expectation. So it's really actually about agreeing expectations.
I like the way you say it's a picture rather than
it's a
set
picture.
of...
Yes. Yeah.
Do entrepreneurs need role profiles?
It's difficult because it's a great question, because, entrepreneurs initially would function at all levels and do everything, But I think so. But I think maybe in the early stages, in the sort of storming stage of a business, I think a role profile could, maybe a very basic role profile can be helpful in just creating firm ground, in terms of saying, well, actually, holding so that the person can hold themselves accountable to doing a number of things and rather just getting stuck in one thing, because it's very easy for entrepreneurs. I'm working with an entrepreneur at the moment who's got a fantastic product. And, she and her team have spent an enormous amount of time on this product, but they don't really know how to sell it.
Right.
So partly for an entrepreneur, it's helpful maybe to have a kind of a sketch role profile, if you like, just to say, well, just to give some kind of guidance. But I think typically, if you think of the forming, storming, norming, performing, I think, you would typically more start doing formal role profiling once you hit the norming phase, and that would be where role profiling would really come into its own.
It's interesting because we had a client who was looking at doing some coaching for a new concern, and there are 3 people who are partners. And the one partner is saying, well, this is why I came into my own business, because I don't want all this bureaucracy and I don't want all the corporate language. but yet those basics are not there. They don't know what to expect from each other, and it's causing conflict.
No. And I mean, I know even in our own business, I mean, we've now, started a new business in Multiplex. And of course, you're running so fast that you don't have time to do role profiles. But then there's this misaligned expectations where you think, well, what are you doing? Because I'm expecting you to do A, B, and C, and you think it's D and E. So you're spending time on D and E, but I'm wanting A and B, and I'm not seeing it. And, it creates tension and, and unnecessary tension very probably because, we're not checking in to understand what we're expecting. And,
we're working hard, but our focus is off.
But not the focus is off. Exactly. And then we're a bit like a ship that leaves port, but we don't know where we're going,
Well, that's a useful metaphor with you and James. James, your profile session is coming up.
But, I mean, I know James spoke about it before, but, when we were sailing from down to Malta and we, the rudder, the autopilot was a degree out, and it was amazing how 2 or 3 hours later we were dramatically further away from where we needed to be. I mean, it's a metaphor that we use, but it just goes to show how those tiny calibrations don't mean anything in the beginning, but a few hours, days, weeks, and months later, they mean significantly different things.
I love that metaphor.
So I think it really helps to understand. Well, this is, and of course, it's a post in the sand. We say, a good role profile in a mature business probably should have more or less a shelf life of around, and if the role doesn't change, obviously if the role changes, it's a different, but if the role doesn't change, it should have a shelf life of about 3 to 5 years typically. I mean, you would need to look at it every year in line with strategy and so on, but, a well-defined role for a psychometrist, for instance, I can't imagine over all the years in Omnicor that it's changed that dramatically. The core components are still there, and it is something that you would look in on, and you would certainly, every time you brought on somebody new, you would look to see, well, where are we now? Does this profile still fit? Do the competencies still fit? But I think certainly, I mean, what happened also with the competencies was initially, when we started Omnicor, there was a lot of focus on the personality testing. And personality testers, are not very predictive of success, And I think, so it became much more helpful in terms of, so you could arguably have, or even arguably, you could have a fantastic test that recommended the person, and then the person doesn't succeed in the role. And then they say the test is wrong.
Right.
It's not the test that's wrong. It's that the requirements of the role were not properly defined up front. So that was why initially, at Omnicor, there was then such a big focus on making sure that when we assessed, it was married to a recent validated role profile, because otherwise it's a waste of money to test.
Right. So, Cathy, where will I find you in 3 to 5 years?
I mean, I'm writing this book on competencies, particularly for the coaches, so that we can tie the gestalts, kind of mindfulness, the creativity aspect and the sort of agency aspect to competencies. But I think particularly competencies give coaches who very probably haven't had HR experience or much experience of the world of work. It gives them a framework for understanding, for helping a coaching client to diagnose what some of the issues are. And it's a starting point for a conversation. It's not the end. So what I'm hoping to do is write these books. I'm hoping to train many more coaches on how to use competencies profitably, in coaching, to really sensitize them to how to coach around competencies in a way that's not didactic, but is adds real insight. So I'm hoping to have a cohort of lovely global coaches doing great work in growing people all over the world. And I think, part of it also is, I think the new world of work is so fast, and these accountabilities, now that also there's very much a global, this the explosion of cultures and people working all over the world, and and I think there's not often people don't know what the expectation is. So you can enter the world of work and there's a set of expectations, but what does it mean when you become a manager or a senior manager, or you move from senior management to exco?
Right.
I mean, the leadership pipeline talks a little bit about it. You've got to unlearn some things to be effective at the next level. So what I'm hoping to do is to kind of give more put more flesh on the bones there, and really sort of contribute to that. That take Elliot Jacks, take Leadership Pipeline, take all the work and experience we've done in competencies over the years, and create some new frameworks, or some adapted frameworks around it.
100% confidence that book's going to be a bestseller.
Oh, I hope so. Thank you.
It was wonderful to chat and to dig into your treasure trove of knowledge and insight. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, really. Thank you.
So welcome back, Marcel. We're going to be doing a Doublethink episode, and it's really cool to be doing this again because we got
Colleen.
Good feedback from the others.
Great, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, so what you're going to be talking about today?
So today, and it has been a bit of a hiatus, we want to apologize for that, but we're talking about the fundamental attribution error, which is, as the name suggests, one of the most researched and fundamental errors in thinking which human beings commit.
Right.
So it has its history back in the 60s. Two researchers in America, Edward Jones and Victor Harris, who first wrote the paper which started the whole research project on the fundamental attribution error. And they discovered that in a very interesting experimental paradigm where students were asked to attribute, and that's where the attribution part of fundamental attribution comes from, they had to attribute or explain the reasons for other people's behavior.
Right.
And they set up an experiment where students had to read passages written by supposed writers about Fidel Castro. Now, back in the 60s in America, it was a very emotive topic, Fidel Castro. It was around about the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Fidel Castro wasn't a well-liked person in America. And the article which the students read was kind of praising of Castro. And so they manipulated the experiment in terms of the explanation they gave as to why the student authors wrote the article which they did. So the experiment basically had a manipulation where the students were told that the authors wrote the article based on a coin flip. So the experimenter said, well, we flipped a coin, and the authors, depending on the result of the coin flip, had to either write a positive article about Castro or a negative article. So the students were told that it was random. This is not the intention of the author, and yet in the experiment they discovered that despite this, a lot of the students ascribed the behavior as internal. So they, especially if it were a positive article on Castro, in which case they didn't like it, and as soon as there was some sort of negative attribution, the students tended to explain the behavior as internal to the author, even though they knew full well that it was a random assignment.
Wow.
So they discovered this statistical effect, if you like. And what was more interesting, perhaps, is that the students weren't aware of it. They didn't understand that was happening. But it happened nonetheless. And so since the 1967 article, there's been a wealth of research and data on the fundamental attribution error and how it applies to various spheres of life, including business.
So how would it apply to business? I mean, in our work, we do a lot of interviewing and we use some science around that. Would it work with that?
Absolutely. So I think that's perhaps one of the most obvious applications of the fundamental attribution error. So just to summarize what it is all about, what the error does to your thinking is that we tend to ascribe negative behaviors which we see in other people to internal reasons. We attribute it to characterological reasons or trait reasons or stable internal reasons. So to give you an example out of a non-business context, if you're at the stop street, let's say you're at a four-way stop, and someone skips their turn in the line, which is a negative event, you don't like it, you thought it was your turn to go, you are very likely, according to the fundamental attribution error research, to ascribe that behavior due to the person's internal attributes. So you may say, oh, that's a stupid person. So you're saying there's something wrong with their intelligence, or they're rude.
Yes.
But it's that kind of person who does that. Now, if you do it yourself, though, then the fundamental attribution error suggests that you would rather look for a situational reason. So if you skip your turn and someone is angry at you and hoots at you, You may, for yourself, explain why you did this based on the fact that you were maybe distracted. I was listening to the radio, I was distracted, I lost count of who was next, so I went and it was an error. Or you may explain it by citing that you're in a hurry. I'm late for a meeting, and therefore I had to skip my turn. I'm very sorry about it, but I had to. So notice that those explanations have nothing to do with you as a human being or your character, but it's rather about the context or the situation which forces you to behave that way. And this is what we find time and time again in research on the fundamental attribution error. So in a business setting, in an interview especially, we find that a lot of times when managers interview other people, candidates, they would ascribe negative things they observe to the person's internal character, which is obviously very, very bad for the candidate.
Right.
Because we don't want to hire people whose personalities don't appeal to us.
So it's unfair in a way.
For sure. It definitely is one of the sources of unfairness and systematic bias in interviewing. So that if you, for instance, have a candidate who arrives late, a lot of times managers would see that as an internal attribute. So they will say they're late because they're the sort of people who don't like being on time. They're sloppy. They're sloppy, they're tardy. So it's all internal attributions. Whereas if they are late for their own meetings, they will often say, no, but I was rushing, or I had to drop my kids off at school, and then from that point onwards, everything ran late. And again, you wouldn't describe the internal reasons to yourself. And that's the essential nature of the fundamental attribution error. People are generally then biased against others based on the negative behaviors they observe.
So what is is there an evolutionary reason for this? Why have we got such a blind spot?
There's a lot of different, in fact, since the 60s, after about 10 years or so of research where, into the 70s where people wanted to just describe the fundamental attribution error, a lot of the subsequent research has been around trying to understand why it happens. So there's several theories, and several of them have a lot of evidence. So the one most appealing one, perhaps, is that it's just the nature of how we observe reality. Because we see only actors, we do not see situations. It's if we go back to our Stop Street example, you're seeing the person opposite you in the car. They are the most obvious active element to this whole picture. You don't see the situation they're in because it's you're blind to it. You don't know that they're also rushing to pick up their kids, or they're also distracted, or whatever it may be. So because actors are the most obvious thing in our visual spectrum, so in an interview you're seeing the person in front of you. They are the most obvious part of the environment to focus on. And so one of the theories suggests that you then ascribe reasons to that actor in a very natural cognitive way, because we're simply blind to context, or very often very blind to context. A related theory is that we tend to prefer ways of thinking which reduces the taxation on our cognitive resources. So we're sort of cognitive misers in that way. We prefer easy thinking, less use of resources, and that has an adaptive evolutionary reason, because it allows you to think of other things. It opens your resource schedule in your brain for doing other things, of being alert for danger, for instance, and of thinking about problems unconsciously and so forth. So there's some adaptive reasons why the fundamental attribution error may be in operation. But in modern societies, where a lot of our work is about perceiving others and working with others in a sophisticated environment, it's not so good for us.
It seems a bit like we very judgmental of others, so maybe that's the whole thing of looking for risk. But of self, we have a blind spot. Although we're in the picture, we've got the context. We easily explain away the behavior.
Well, I think there's an interaction in terms of the way we explain our own behavior, and there's another bias there which interacts with the fundamental attribution error, which is called the self-serving bias. And that's another very robust, very well-researched bias in human thinking, where we tend to believe better things about ourselves than others. We tend to manipulate the interpretation of situations so that it favors us rather than negatively influences us. So you can imagine if you combine those two, it's quite powerful, in the sense that if I do bad things or wrong things, or I make errors, I'm much more likely to explain it away by making myself appear either perhaps the victim in that situation, or having made a perfectly understandable error. but really veering away from any kind of internal stable reasons for why it did that. So, and we see that in various contexts. I mean, even the most extreme of contexts, if you look at records of war criminals, they will always have a very self-serving explanation for why they did the things they did. It would be because of the context. I was just following orders, and I thought I was doing the right thing, and so forth. Very seldom would someone really come out and say, it's because I'm a really bad human being, or because I am a psychopath. People don't say those things.
Well, especially not psychopaths.
Sure.
So, Marcel, if we take it back into some of our other products, that being the 360 review, does this explain a little bit around the blind spot that we have and why people are sometimes so defensive to the feedback?
Absolutely. I think any assessment usually speaks about something internal to you. And so when we see a lot of defensiveness around that, it's because people are not used to looking for answers to their own behavior inside of themselves. They're much more used to seeing contextual reasons for their behavior. And it's a very interesting interplay because in social psychology, for instance, we know that context and situation, in fact, those two things do play very important roles in our behavior as causal agents. It's not just all character and the type of person you are. It's often the situation you're in which will shape your behavior. So in some ways, that's sort of why we call it the fundamental attribution error. It's an error in thinking. It's not correct to ascribe people's behaviors or their way of doing things in terms of character and personality all the time. There's obviously an interplay, but situation and context, those things play far larger roles in the reasons for people's behavior than most people can imagine. And there's a ton of research to suggest that. Even the things you experience the moment before the next situation will influence your behavior more than something like an internal attribute like personality. And that's really why it's a shame when we fall victim to the fundamental attribution error, because we're basically not seeing reality very accurately when we use it.
But it's very unconscious. So how do you, I guess it requires huge self-awareness all the time. But how do you as an individual, for example, in coaching, it seems applicable. How would you help people or managers to use this?
Yeah, well, one of the most robust finding in research, and what a lot of researchers have now started investigating, is exactly that. How do we counter unconscious biases like fundamental attribution error? One of the best ways of doing it so far, which we found from the research, is what's called perspective taking. So the more you are able to take someone else's perspective, the less likely you are to commit the fundamental attribution error. And it takes practice. Like most skills, it's something that you have to practice over and over again to make that your unconscious bias rather than the one which is already in your brain. But it's very difficult, and you're very likely to suffer from the fundamental attribution error across your lifespan in many situations. But I think it might be useful in a business context, for instance, if you know you're going into a situation where that error is going to influence you and more likely influence someone else, to really try and take their perspective more than just letting your biases roam free. So, for instance, I'm thinking of things like an interview situation, or if you're going to run a meeting with people, to really try and take other people's perspective. Think of yourself in an interview. If you were that candidate sitting, in front of this panel of people who are interviewing them, how would you feel? Would you feel very nervous? Would you be very nervous about your answers? Would you have doubts about whether you're going to do well at the interview? Of course you would. Most likely you would have all those things. And as soon as you start taking the other person's perspective and trying to see things from their point of view, you are sort of diluting the actor part of your attribution, and you're starting to understand their situation. And the person who was late, maybe they had to catch several forms of public transport to get there. And if that were your perspective, you would also be late. You'd be worried about being on time for many different things and so forth. You'd think of all the things you would use as an excuse of being late. Right? I was rushing, I had my kids, etc., etc. And so the more we can take perspective, the less likely we are to fall victim and prey to the fundamental attribution error.
I think as I'm listening to you, Marcel, I'm thinking how hard this is to shift with internal behavior.
Very hard.
And I think it's around often we don't want to be caught out as wrong. So we can't be seen as anything less than perfect, especially in the business world. It's career limiting if you've made a mistake, so it's easier. But Yeah, so in South Africa, when we're driving along the roads, for example, we experience this a lot.
All the time. I mean, we've got perhaps more opportunity than most to really practice that type of controlling our own unconscious biases when we are on the road. We know that, for instance, here in Johannesburg, there's a lot of pretty aggressive driving going on the road, and it's very easy to ascribe internal reasons for that behavior when you see it in others, especially if you see it consistently. So a lot of us complain about taxis, for instance, that they consistently break the rules of the road, that they're consistently very dangerous on the road. So it's very easy to ascribe internal characteristics to those drivers, to say, well, maybe they are all psychopaths, maybe they are antisocial, maybe they are just bad people. But if you try and take perspective and you try and investigate what it's like to be a taxi driver in Johannesburg, you may find that it's not a great life, that these people are paid very poorly, their working conditions are often not even legal, they have massive targets to meet, they have to do what they can to get as much money, and they're often living in poverty anyway.
And threatened as well.
There's a lot of aggression already. So it's not a great environment to be in. And so if you take that perspective and think, well, if I were in that situation, wouldn't I perhaps also do the same?
So is that then the confirmation bias eventually? The more you see that happening,
yes,
you use that.
Well, you only then focus on things which confirm your bias. When a taxi driver is in fact kind on the road or thanks you for letting him in, you'll just forget it.
Right.
And you'll only focus on times when they behave nasty. So yes, it interacts very much with a confirmation bias, but it's really useful to take perspective and think, would I not behave the same? There's, of course, tremendous peer pressure to behave the same. We all know that when you see other people creating a norm, it's very difficult not to follow that norm. So if you're the one taxi driver in Joburg who's following the rules of the road, the other taxi drivers are going to pressure you not to do that. And you're going to feel pressure to follow the norm. So these are all contextual reasons, which are probably why people behave the way they do more so than internal reasons. And that's really the insight we gain from researching things like the fundamental attribution error, is not only are we understanding the real reasons for behavior, but we're understanding why we often distort reality, and we're not seeing things for the way they are, but rather for the way we are. And I think that's, for me, one of the most fascinating parts of this sort of research and talking about these things with you, is understanding that human nature.
And I think it can lead to so much unnecessary conflict because
Absolutely.
we're making these sweeping assumptions, and even in relationships, where we're assuming stuff that's just really not true.
Absolutely. I mean, whenever you think of any conflict you've had recently with another person, often there will be a lot of blaming going on. Like, you're this kind of person. Why are you always doing that? And, I don't like it when you do this to me. It's often implied that it's inside the person, the reasons for the behavior. It's not contextual. It's not because they had a long, horrible day at work and now they're just short with everybody. It's because they are a short person and a mean person. And parents, of course, can apply this to their kids. Kids can apply it to their parents. But I think and you mentioned earlier, how do we get rid of it? I think it's tough. You can't really reprogram your brain on that level because it's old parts of the brain which are implied here in these biases. But you can become more aware of their influence on you. So it's we all can think of impulses we may have which kind of come almost automatically to our minds when we're in certain situations. For instance, maybe you have an automatic impulse sometimes to just tell someone what you really think of them. But you're able to suppress
would I do that myself?
Maybe. Or we all have these sort of, it's very personal often. People don't always like talking about it, but I'm sure that most human beings have had experiences where they've had an automatic impulse to do something perhaps not so nice, but they've been able to control that and suppress it. It's much the same with these thinking errors, but you have to become more aware of them. And for instance, great practice would be, if you're on the roads, you might even be listening to this podcast while you're driving right now, is to start practicing that. Focus on the times when you feel frustrated with someone's behavior on the road, and then try and take their perspective. Try and remember when you did that very same thing last time you were driving. Why did you do it? You'll probably find a situational reason for why you did it. Ascribe that reason to the other person. This is sort of how we can teach ourselves and teach our minds to become more aware of biases. So, the bias, I don't think, should always be in the driving seat. You can occasionally shift it to the passenger seat and take control.
Well, I think you've given us a lot to think about, and we can apply this in many areas in our life. So thanks, Marcel, and we look forward to your next episode.
Thanks a lot.
Well, it seems agility is the new magic competency. Thank goodness for brain plasticity. How well do you know your critical competencies required for your current role? And what are your joint expectations with your company? Check it out. Next podcast, we have Dennis Zitzman coming up, and he's an amazing entrepreneur, and you're going to have a masterclass of growing businesses. Thank you again to our producer, Matt Bessling, and send through any questions and comments you may have. A special shout out to Deepa Moodley for her great compliment about our podcasts. Check out our website, www.omnicor.co.za.